Here's a question that trips up almost everyone who hears it for the first time. If Russia had an actual parliament, an elected body of lawmakers sitting in a real chamber, voting on real legislation for over a decade before the revolution, why do we still talk about the fall of the Romanovs like Russia went from absolute medieval monarchy straight to communist upheaval overnight? Where did the parliament go? Why didn't it stop any of this? Why didn't it save the Tsar, or save Russia, or save itself? Most Americans have a mental image of 1917 that skips a step. We picture a Tsar on a throne, then we picture Lenin, and somewhere in between we assume was just chaos. But that is not what happened. Between 1906 and 1917, Russia had a functioning, elected national legislature called the State Duma. It had political parties. It had floor debates. It had opposition leaders who stood up in front of the government and accused it on the record of incompetence. Some of its members would go on to help run the country after the monarchy collapsed. This was not a rubber stamp that existed for one afternoon. It sat on and off for 11 years. And that is exactly what makes the ending of this story so strange. Because having a parliament is supposed to be the release valve. It's supposed to be the thing that lets frustration get expressed through debate instead of through revolution. It is, in the story most of us were taught about how democracies mature, the safety mechanism. Britain had one. France eventually got one. The United States built one from scratch. And each time, in the popular imagination, the parliament is the thing that stands between a country and collapse. Russia had one, and the monarchy collapsed anyway. So today we're going to actually walk through what this parliament was, what it could and couldn't do, who fought to create it, who fought to strangle it, and how piece by piece, a body that was supposed to represent the will of 170 million people became something closer to a stage prop in the final act of the Romanov dynasty. Because the real answer to why the Tsar fell despite having a parliament is not he didn't have one. It's that he built one specifically designed not to work, and it took him 11 years to find out that a fake safety valve is worse than no safety valve at all. A throne that never wanted company. To understand why the Duma existed at all, you have to understand what Nicholas II actually believed about his own job. This was not a monarch who saw himself as a ceremonial figurehead waiting to be modernized. Nicholas II believed, sincerely and to his dying day, that he had been placed on the throne of Russia by God, and that sharing his authority with an elected body was not political compromise. It was a betrayal of a sacred trust passed down from his father. That belief was not eccentric for a Russian Tsar. Russia had never had anything resembling a national representative assembly with real legislative power. There was no Magna Carta moment, no centuries-long tug-of-war between crown and nobility that had slowly carved out chartered rights the way it had in England. Russian autocracy in the early 20th century was, on paper, almost exactly what it had been under Peter the Great 200 years earlier. One man, answerable to no one but God, sitting at the top of an enormous, sprawling, mostly agrarian empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. So when people talk about Russia getting a parliament in 1905, it's worth pausing on the word getting. Nicholas did not wake up one day and decide that representative government was a good idea whose time had come. He was forced into it. And the force that did the forcing was a chaotic, bloody, nationwide upheaval that historians call the Revolution of 1905, a wave of strikes, peasant uprisings, mutinies, and urban unrest that was triggered in part by catastrophic and humiliating military defeat against Japan, and in part by decades of pressure that had simply never had anywhere to go. The spark that is usually cited as the true beginning of that unrest happened on a January morning in St. Petersburg, when a peaceful crowd of workers, led by an Orthodox priest, marched toward the Winter Palace to deliver a petition to the Tsar asking for better working conditions, land reform, and a national assembly. Imperial troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd. Hundreds were killed or wounded. The event became known as Bloody Sunday, and it shattered something that had quietly underpinned Russian society for centuries. The ordinary peasant and worker's instinctive faith that the Tsar, whatever his ministers might do, was fundamentally on their side. After Bloody Sunday, that faith was gone, and strikes exploded across the empire. By October of 1905, with the empire teetering and a general strike paralyzing the country, Nicholas's advisors, chief among them a capable and pragmatic minister named Sergei Witt, convinced him that he had exactly two options. He could crush the unrest through pure military force and risk a far bloodier and more uncontrollable civil conflict, or he could make a political concession significant enough to peel moderate reformers away from the revolutionaries and buy the regime time. Nicholas, by his own private admission, hated the second option, but he signed it anyway. That concession was the October Manifesto, issued on October 30th, 1905. It promised Russians basic civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, and it promised the creation of an elected State Duma with real legislative teeth. The manifesto's language was unambiguous on this last point. It pledged that going forward, no law could take effect without the approval of the elected representatives of the people. For a country that had never had anything like it, this sounded, on its face, like the birth of Russian constitutional government. Liberals across the empire celebrated. Crowds in the streets treated it as a genuine turning point. And in his private diary, Nicholas II wrote something that should have been a warning sign for everyone who took that manifesto at face value. He described the day he signed it as a nightmare, and he told confidence that he had been talked into a document he considered a personal betrayal of everything the Russian crown was supposed to stand for. The fine print that undid the promise. Here is where the story usually gets skipped over in casual retellings, and it is the single most important detail in the entire arc of the Duma's failure. The October Manifesto was a promise. It was not by itself a law, constitution, or a binding structure. And the 6 months between that promise and its actual implementation gave the imperial government just enough time to quietly gut it. In April of 1906, days before the very first Duma was scheduled to convene, Nicholas issued a set of fundamental laws, essentially Russia's first written constitution. And where the October Manifesto had promised that no law could come into force without the Duma's approval, the fundamental laws reasserted something very different. They declare that the emperor of all the Russias possessed supreme autocratic power. They establish a second legislative chamber, the State Council, half of whose members were directly appointed by the Tsar himself, giving the crown a built-in veto over anything the elected Duma tried to pass. They gave Nicholas the power, under Article 87, to issue emergency decrees by himself whenever the Duma was not in session, decrees that technically needed retroactive approval, but which in practice let the government simply govern around the legislature for months at stretch. And crucially, the fundamental laws stripped the Duma of any authority to alter those very fundamental laws, meaning the elected chamber could never legally expand its own power, no matter how large its majority. The Duma did retain genuine authority in several areas. It had to approve the state budget in most categories, it could question ministers, it could initiate certain legislation, and no ordinary law could be enacted without its consent. This was not nothing. But the ceiling on that authority had been fixed in stone before a single vote was ever cast, and the Tsar retained the power to appoint and dismiss the entire government, the Council of Ministers, without any input from the chamber the country had just elected. In other words, Russia's new parliament could complain loudly about the government. It could not actually choose the government, remove the government through a vote, or override the emperor on anything that mattered to him. Count Witt, the very minister who had pushed Nicholas toward the October Manifesto in the first place, reportedly warned that revising the fundamental laws before the Duma even met would be seen correctly as reneging on the promise. He was right, and it set the tone for everything that followed. The Duma opened its first session in a mood of celebration and closed it in a mood of open confrontation, because the reformist majority that Russians had elected discovered almost immediately that the government had no intention of actually working with them. 4 chances and 4 collapses. Between 1906 and 1917, Russia elected 4 State Dumas, and the story of each one tells you something different about how the system was designed to fail. The first Duma convened in the spring of 1906 under a broad, if indirect, franchise. Nearly all male subjects over the age of 25 who were not serving in the military or convicted of crimes had some path to a vote, though votes were filtered through an elaborate system of electoral colleges organized by social class rather than direct ballots for individual candidates. The result was a chamber dominated by liberal reformers, chiefly the constitutional Democrats, known as the Cadets, alongside a substantial bloc of left-wing peasant and labor representatives. This Duma immediately pushed for things the government considered radical for the time: land reform that would redistribute estates to the peasantry, expanded civil rights, and a genuine transfer of ministerial accountability to the legislature. The government stonewalled almost every proposal. After just 72 days, Nicholas dissolved the first Duma entirely. A group of the dismissed deputies, furious, gathered across the border in Finland and issued what became known as the Vyborg Manifesto, urging Russian citizens to engage in passive resistance, refusing to pay taxes or report for military conscription as a protest against the dissolution. It went nowhere. The government simply barred the manifesto's signatories from ever running for the Duma again, removing a significant chunk of the country's most prominent liberal politicians from future participation in the very institution they had been elected to serve in. The Second Duma, elected in 1907, turned out even less to the government's liking. Boycotts by socialist parties during the first election had been lifted, and the resulting chamber was, if anything, more left-leaning than the first. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, who had been appointed in the wake of the First Duma's dissolution, accused a bloc of social democratic deputies of plotting an armed uprising against the state and demanded the Duma strip dozens of them of their parliamentary immunity so they could be arrested. When the chamber refused to comply fast enough, Nicholas dissolved it too, after barely more than 3 months in session. This is where the story takes its most decisive turn. Because dissolving a Duma was technically legal under the fundamental laws, the Tsar could do that whenever he wanted, as long as he scheduled new elections. What Stolypin did next was different. Alongside the dissolution, he unilaterally rewrote the electoral law itself, without the Duma's consent, in direct violation of the fundamental law's own promise that the Duma had to approve changes to the electoral system. This became known as the June 1907 coup, and even sympathetic historians of the period generally use that word, coup, without hesitation, because that is functionally what it was. It's worth pausing on how Russians actually voted in this period, because it explains a lot about how easily the system could be manipulated in the first place. Nobody cast a ballot for a named candidate the way an American would. Voting was organized through a system of curiae, separate electoral categories for landowners, urban property holders, peasants, and, eventually, workers, each of which chose delegates, who then gathered in provincial assemblies to choose the actual Duma deputies. It was elaborate, indirect, and crucially adjustable. A government that wanted a different outcome didn't need to ban anyone from voting outright. It just had to quietly reweight how many delegates each curia was allowed to send, and the shape of the entire chamber could shift without a single person technically losing the right to vote. That is precisely the lever Stolypin pulled in 1907. Stolypin himself is a more complicated figure than the coup alone suggests, and it's worth understanding why a man capable of engineering an electoral rollback was, at the same time, one of the more genuinely reform-minded officials the late empire produced. As governor of Saratov province during the 1905 unrest, he had earned a reputation for ruthlessly suppressing peasant uprisings, a reputation grim enough that the military courts he championed for dealing with revolutionary violence became bitterly nicknamed Stolypin's neckties by his critics. But he also believed sincerely that Russia's autocracy could only survive by modernizing its economy from the ground up, which is why he pushed so hard for the land reforms the more conservative Third Duma eventually passed. He wanted a stable, land-owning peasant class that had a personal stake in the existing order, rather than a grievance against it, reform aimed not at weakening the throne but at saving it. He very nearly didn't survive to see any of it through. In August 1906, 3 assassins detonated a bomb at a public reception at his private residence. Stolypin himself was barely injured, but 28 other people were killed, and his young daughter and son were both badly hurt in the blast. It was one of dozens of assassination attempts and political killings that punctuated this period of Russian history, a reminder that the tension between the autocracy and its opponents was never confined to polite debate inside a legislative chamber. It was playing out in bombings, mutinies, and street violence throughout the empire, and is part of why so many members of the government, Stolypin included, treated the Duma's radical wings less as a nuisance and more as an existential threat, to be neutralized by any means available. Stolypin would not escape a second attempt. In 1911, he was shot and killed at a Kiev opera house by a man who, in one of the era's stranger footnotes, was simultaneously an informant for the secret police and a revolutionary sympathizer. His death removed the one figure in the government who had a genuine long-term plan for stabilizing the empire from within its existing structure, rather than simply managing crises as they arrived. The new electoral law dramatically slashed the voting weight of peasants, industrial workers, and non-Russian ethnic minorities, while massively boosting the influence of large landowners and wealthy property holders. Some estimates from the period suggest the reform left roughly 1 in 6 adult men with any meaningful path to the ballot at all, and among those who could vote, the weighting system was engineered so heavily in favor of the propertied classes that a small circle of wealthy landowners could outvote entire provinces of peasants. The stated goal, openly discussed by Stolypin and his allies, was to guarantee a Duma that the government could actually live with. It worked in the narrowest sense. The Third Duma, elected under this new law in the fall of 1907, was dominated by the conservative and moderate Octoberist Party, named for their nominal support of the October Manifesto, and it became the only one of the four Dumas to serve its entire constitutional term without being forcibly dissolved. It passed Stolypin's land reforms aimed at breaking up peasant communes and creating a class of independent farmers loyal to the crown, though those reforms achieved only limited success. By 1914, only about a tenth of Russia's peasant communes had actually been dissolved under the program. But calling the Third Duma a functioning parliament in the way we'd recognize the term is a stretch. It was a legislature elected by a franchise deliberately rigged to exclude the vast majority of the population from having a meaningful say, sitting alongside an upper chamber the Tsar half-appointed himself, unable to remove a single minister it disapproved of, no matter how badly that minister performed. The Fourth Duma, elected in 1912 under the same restrictive law, looked similar on paper, dominated again by Octobrists and right-leaning nationalists. But it would end up playing a role in Russian history that nobody who designed the 1907 electoral law could have possibly intended. A war the parliament couldn't fix and couldn't ignore. For its first 2 years, the Fourth Duma behaved much like the government hoped it would, cautious, cooperative, unwilling to rock the boat. And then, in the summer of 1914, Russia entered the First World War, and everything about the relationship between the Duma and the throne began to change, not because the Duma suddenly gained new legal powers, but because the war exposed, in brutal and undeniable terms, just how badly the autocracy was actually functioning. Russia's early war effort was catastrophic. Ammunition shortages left soldiers going into battle without enough rifles to arm every man in a unit. Supply lines collapsed. Casualties mounted into the millions. And back home, inflation spiraled, food and fuel shortages spread through the cities, and a bewildering rapid rotation of prime ministers and ministers, sometimes replaced within months of appointment, in a pattern contemporaries bitterly nicknamed ministerial leapfrog, made it clear that the government had no stable hand on the wheel. Compounding all of this was the deeply unpopular influence of Grigory Rasputin, the mystic healer who had gained extraordinary sway over the imperial family, particularly Empress Alexandra, due to his apparent ability to ease the suffering of the couple's hemophiliac son, the heir to the throne. When Nicholas left the capital in 1915 to personally take command of Russian forces at the front, a decision most of his own advisors argued against, since it meant the Tsar was now directly, personally associated with every military failure, day-to-day governance in Petrograd fell increasingly to Alexandra, who leaned heavily on Rasputin's advice in selecting and dismissing ministers. Rasputin was assassinated by a group of conservative noblemen in December 1916, but by then the damage to the monarchy's credibility was already done. By August 1915, deputies from across the political spectrum in the Fourth Duma, roughly half of the entire chamber, spanning liberal cadets on one side to moderate nationalists on the other, banded together into a coalition called the Progressive Bloc. Their demand was, by the standards of the time, moderate rather than revolutionary. They wanted the Tsar to appoint a Ministry of Confidence, meaning a cabinet of ministers who actually had the trust of the legislature and the public, one capable of coordinating the war effort competently. They were not asking to abolish the monarchy. They were asking, essentially, for the government to start listening to them. Nicholas's response was to suspend the Duma's session. It met only in short, scattered bursts for the rest of 1915 and through 1916, a few days here, a few weeks there, with the government repeatedly proroguing it whenever criticism got too pointed. In November 1916, cadet leader Pavel Milyukov stood up in the chamber and delivered a scathing public address cataloging government failures, repeatedly punctuating his list of grievances with the rhetorical question, "Is this stupidity or is it treason?" He did not call for revolution. He did not even directly attack the monarchy as an institution. But the speech spread rapidly and became, in the words of historians who study the period, something close to a public storm signal that revolution might be coming, because it captured, in a single blunt sentence, what a huge swath of educated Russian society had come to believe about their own government. This is the part of the story that matters most for understanding the Duma's ultimate failure to prevent collapse. The Fourth Duma was doing exactly what a parliament is supposed to do, debating openly, organizing coalitions, publicly pressuring the executive to reform. And the Tsar's answer again and again was simply to suspend it, ignore it, or wait it out. A parliament that can be switched off by royal decree whenever it becomes inconvenient is not actually functioning as a check on power. It's functioning as a controlled outlet for frustration that the crown can seal shut the moment the pressure gets uncomfortable, right up until the moment the pressure has nowhere else left to go. The chamber that outlived the throne. By February of 1917, conditions in the capital, now renamed Petrograd because St. Petersburg sounded too German for wartime tastes, had become explosive. Bread shortages, brutal winter cold, and years of accumulated wartime strain brought hundreds of thousands of workers and women into the streets. What began as International Women's Day demonstrations on February 23rd by the old Russian calendar snowballed within days into a general strike, and then into something far more dangerous for the regime. Soldiers garrisoned in the capital, ordered to fire on the crowds, began mutinying instead, joining the demonstrators rather than suppressing them. As the situation spiraled, Duma chairman Mikhail Rodzianko, himself a conservative, monarchist Octoberist, not a radical by any measure, sent Nicholas a series of increasingly desperate telegrams, warning that the capital had descended into anarchy, that the government had effectively collapsed, and pleading with the Tsar to appoint a government the public could actually trust before it was too late. Nicholas's reported reaction to one of these telegrams was dismissive to the point of disbelief in what was unfolding. He reportedly told an aide he wouldn't even bother responding to what he considered nonsense from Rodzianko. By the time Nicholas ordered troops to simply crush the unrest by force, it was too late for that order to mean anything. The military units he was counting on were themselves dissolving into mutiny or refusing to fire. Nicholas formally dissolved the Fourth Duma on February 27th, attempting, even at this late stage, to use the same tool that had worked against the first three Dumas, simply switching the chamber off. This time it did not work. Rather than disbanding, the Duma's members reconvened informally as a body calling itself the Provisional Committee of the State Duma, under Rodzianko's leadership, and effectively declared themselves the only functioning national authority left in Russia, working alongside a rival body of workers' and soldiers' representatives that had reconstituted itself as the Petrograd Soviet, echoing a similar council that had briefly existed during the 1905 uprising. Within days, with his own generals informing him that the army could no longer be relied upon to defend him and that abdication was the only path that might preserve some semblance of order, Nicholas signed his abdication on March 2nd by the old Russian calendar, March 15th by the modern Gregorian calendar the West used, addressing the document, in one of history's more pointed ironies, to Rodzianko, the same Duma chairman he had spent years alternately dissolving, suspending, and ignoring. The document Rodzianko helped draft became the basis for the first provisional government, staffed substantially by former Duma deputies, which would attempt, and ultimately fail, to steer Russia through the months leading up to the Bolshevik seizure of power that October. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended not with the Duma successfully forcing reform through the ordinary channels of legislative pressure, but with the Duma's own members improvising a new source of authority out of the wreckage, because the formal channel the Tsar had built for them had already been dissolved by his own hand for the fourth and final time. What makes this moment so striking in hindsight is how conservative most of the people driving it actually were. Rodzianko was not a revolutionary. He was a wealthy Octoberist landowner, a monarchist to his core, who spent the war years trying to save the dynasty from itself rather than trying to overthrow it. The men who gathered in the Duma's Tauride Palace in those final days of February were, for the most part, exactly the kind of moderate, property-owning, cautiously reformist politicians the 1907 electoral law had been specifically engineered to produce. That is arguably the sharpest irony in the entire story. Stolypin's rigged franchise had succeeded in filling the third and fourth Dumas with men who had no interest in tearing down the monarchy, and it was precisely those men, the ones the system had been built to trust, who ended up standing in the room when the throne finally had nowhere else to turn. The parliament that was never allowed to be won. So back to the original question. Why did the Tsar fall when Russia had a parliament? Because the Duma was never actually designed to prevent a crisis like 1917. It was designed to survive one specific crisis, the revolution of 1905, and then to be quietly contained the moment that particular danger had passed. It could debate. It could criticize. In its earlier years, it genuinely held meaningful authority over budgets and certain categories of legislation. But it could never choose the government. It could never bind the Tsar to accept its advice. And every time it grew too assertive, the crown had a legal or extra-legal tool ready to neutralize it. Dissolution, a rewritten electoral law, a prorogued session. A parliament that exists at the pleasure of the very throne it's meant to check is not a constitutional monarchy. It's an autocracy wearing a parliament as a costume, and costumes tend to come off exactly when the wearer needs them to hold together most. There's a version of this story where Nicholas II takes the Progressive Bloc's modest request seriously back in 1915, a cabinet that actually has the country's confidence, and history goes somewhere very different. Historians still debate whether a genuine constitutional partnership between Crown and Duma was ever truly achievable in Russia between 1905 and 1917, or whether the underlying tensions in Russian society had already grown too large for any parliament, real or fake, to contain. What isn't really debated is this: the one version of the Duma that Nicholas was never willing to try was the one the October Manifesto had actually promised back in 1905. He built a legislature and then spent 11 years making absolutely sure it could never become one in practice. And when the actual crisis came, the institution he'd hollowed out for over a decade had nothing left to offer him, not because parliaments don't work, but because his had never been allowed to. It's worth sitting with what that means, because it isn't just a Russian story. Every country that has ever built a representative body has had to answer the same underlying question Nicholas refused to answer honestly. Does the legislature actually hold power, or does it just look like it does? The gap between those two things can sit quietly for years, even decades, showing no visible cracks, right up until the exact moment a country needs that institution to actually function and discovers, all at once, that it never really could. If you found this one interesting, there's a lot more of Russian and world history where this came from, and the way this channel keeps making videos like it is honestly just people deciding to stick around for the next one. So if that's you, go ahead and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you think. And I'm curious about something. Drop a comment and tell me what city or state you're watching this from. I always like seeing just how far and wide this stuff actually reaches. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.